Timeline. Explore the key events in disabled people's long fight for rights and inclusion, from legislation and policy to activism and developments in culture and society. Key: activism, legislation and policy, culture and society. 1500 to 1800. 1547. Culture and society. Bethlehem Hospital, also known as Bedlam, becomes the first recognised institution for mental patients in England. By 1914, there were over 100,000 people living in 100 mental institutions around the country. 1601. Legislation and policy. The Poor Law makes a distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor, dividing people into three categories: the impotent poor, the old, disabled and sick; the able-bodied poor, those fit to work; the idle or vagrant poor, those unwilling to work. The legacy of the Act continues to inform policies and attitudes today. 1744. Legislation and policy. The Vagrancy Act enabled the detention of people experiencing mental distress for the first time. 1800 to 1900. 1868. Culture and society. The Royal National Institute for the Blind, RNIB, is formed. This marks the beginning of modern charitable organisations established by philanthropists or parents and carers for disabled people. 1880. Culture and society. An international conference of deaf educators takes place in Milan. A resolution bans the use of sign language in schools across Europe and the United States, leading to a drastic decline in the use of the language. 1890. Activism. The British Deaf Association, BDA, was formed in Leeds as the British Deaf and Dumb Association, BDDA. 1893. Activism. The National League of the Blind is established. It is registered as a trade union for blind workers in 1899. 1900 to 1945. 1907. Culture and society. The Eugenics Education Society was formed. They believed allowing disabled people to reproduce would lead to the degeneration of the human race. Many prominent intellectuals, politicians, and social reformers from across the political spectrum supported the movement. 1920. Activism. The National League of the Blind marched to a rally in London in 1920 to demand better working conditions and pay. 1920. Legislation and policy. The Blind Persons Act results in the first legislation passed, introduced and supported by disabled people to provide support for blind people through local authorities. 1924. Culture and society. The first World Games for the Deaf, now Deaflympics, held in Paris. 1944. Legislation and policy. The Disabled Persons Employment Act was passed as the number of disabled people increased due to World War II. This act introduces the first legal definition of a disabled person, and it meant employers had to employ a percentage of disabled people in their workforce. However, the act was not effective as it was never properly monitored. 1945 to 1970. 1948. Culture and society. Stoke Mandeville Games takes place, the forerunner of the Paralympic Games. 1965. Activism. The Disablement Income Group, DIG, was formed and campaigned for an adequate income for disabled people who were not able to work. It was much harder for disabled people to gain work because of discrimination by employers or lack of accessibility in society. Mid-1960s. Activism. The national campaign for the young chronically sick begins to promote the need for an alternative to living in hospital and reliance on the support of family. 1970 to 1980. 1970. Legislation and policy. The Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act is passed. The Act is the first in the world to give disabled people rights. Local councils have to provide for disabled people, and public buildings are required to be accessible. Although the Act was an important step forward, many felt it still gave too much power to medical professionals. 1972. Activism. The first Center for Independent Living, CIL, is set up in Berkeley, California. This builds on the Disabled Students Program established by Ed Roberts and his associates at the University of California's Berkeley campus. The CIL is set up to provide advice and support for the wider community. 1972. Activism. Paul Hunt writes a letter to the Guardian newspaper calling for disabled people to form a group to fight against discrimination and segregation. The Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, is formed soon after. Key members included Paul Hunt, Vic Finkelstein, Maggie Davis, and Ken Davis. 1974. Legislation and Policy. Alf Morris is appointed as the first Minister for the Disabled. This role is established to help raise the status of disability issues within Parliament. 1976. Activism. UPIAS publish Fundamental Principles of Disability, which is the basis of the social model of disability. 1976. Activism. The National Union of the Deaf, NUD, is founded when deaf people assembled in Wimbledon to form an organisation exclusively run by themselves. Its aim was to restore the rights of the deaf. 1970s and 1980s. Culture and Society. This period saw the growth of the disability arts movement in the UK. Disability Arts in London, DAIL, was a significant organisation, and Disability Arts magazine, DAM, was an important publication, both of which contributed to a community of disabled people. 1980 to 1990. 1981. Activism. The United Nations International Year of Disabled People, IYDP, sees the formation of a growing number of disabled people's organisations. These include the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, BCODP, and the Derbyshire Coalition of Disabled People, DCDP. 1984. Activism. The first Centre for Independent Living, CIL, in the UK is established in Hampshire. It is soon followed by CILs in Derbyshire and Greenwich. 1984. Activism. People First is founded as a national self-advocacy organisation run by and for people with learning disabilities. Its aims are to speak up and campaign for the rights of people with learning disabilities. People First became a charity in 1996. 1985. Activism. The Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, GMCDP, is formed to promote the inclusion of disabled people in society. 1980s and 1990s. Activism. This period saw increased activity by disabled people lobbying the government for a civil rights law that would make discrimination against disabled people illegal. 1990 to 2000. 1990. Activism. The Campaign for Accessible Transport, CAT, is one of the first disabled people's groups to use direct action. 1990. Activism. The first protest against Telethon, a television show that raised money for charity. Disabled people felt that the language used and images shown were demeaning, portraying disabled people as objects of pity. Telethon ended in 1992 after the campaign grew and thousands picketed London Weekend Television Studio. 1991. Activism. Regard was founded to challenge homophobia in the disabled people's movement and the exclusion of disabled people from the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender LGBT community. 1993. Activism. The Disabled People's Direct Action Network, DANS, first public action takes place in Christchurch, Dorset. 1995. Legislation and Policy. Labour MP Harry Barnes tries unsuccessfully to push through the Civil Rights Disabled Persons Bill, or Barnes Bill. The Barnes Bill was similar to a private member's bill first tabled by Roger Berry in 1993 to 1994. It built on the first bill of this kind created by Jack Ashley in 1983 and sought to outlaw discrimination against disabled people in law. 1995. Legislation and Policy. The rejection of the Barnes Bill and ongoing campaigns by disabled people lead to the landmark introduction of the Disability Discrimination Act, DDA. Even though the DDA lacked the strength of the Barnes proposals, it made it illegal to discriminate against disabled people in connection with employment, the provision of goods, facilities and services, or the disposal or management of premises. Service providers must now make reasonable adjustments to enable disabled people to access their services. 1996. Activism. The term neurodiversity is first used in a dissertation by Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, on the autism spectrum. The term first appears in print in 1998 in an article by journalist Harvey Bloom for the Atlantic newspaper. It stated, "Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general." 1996. Legislation and policy. The Community Care Direct Payments Act was introduced after concerted lobbying since 1989 by the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, BCODP's Independent Living Committee. This created direct payments for disabled people and led to more personal choice with regards to the care and support that disabled people might require. 2000 to 2010. 2003. Legislation and policy. The campaign for British Sign Language (BSL) recognition was successful when the UK government made a statement formally recognising the language. This was the result of many years of campaigning by deaf people. 2003. Activism. Developmental Adult Neurodiversity Association, DANDA, was founded, an organisation run by and for neurodiverse people. It was set up to represent and support the neurodiverse community. 2004. Culture and Society. Disability Arts Online starts as an independent organisation by Colin Hambrook, though this began in 2002 as part of Artsline. 2005. Activism. Autistic Pride Day was created in 2005 on the online forum Aspies for Freedom. On 18th of June every year, there are celebrations of this worldwide, online and offline. 2006. Activism. Not Dead Yet UK, NDY UK, was formed in response to the growing media focus on campaigns for the right to die through assisted suicide. NDY UK saw these campaigns as an attempt at legitimising the killing of terminally ill and disabled people. 2009. Legislation and policy. The Autism Act is passed. It was the first condition-specific act to create provision for the needs of autistic people. 2010 to 2022. 2010. Activism. Disabled People Against the Cuts, DPAC, is formed by a group of disabled people following a mass protest against the austerity cuts and their impact on disabled people. 2010. Legislation and policy. The Equality Act merged the earlier Disability Discrimination Act into a single act. The Equality Act was said to have led to a loss of focus on disability discrimination and a sense of loss of rights among disabled people by a House of Lords Committee investigation. 2012. Legislation and policy. The Welfare Reform Act includes the introduction of universal credit and the under-occupancy penalty, which becomes more widely known as the bedroom tax. Disabled people are amongst the worst affected by the changes. 2013. Legislation and policy. The move from Disability Living Allowance, DLA, to Personal Independence Payment, PIP, is announced. This overturns elements of the social model which were recognised in the DLA system to the individualistic basis of PIP. 2013. Activism. A national campaign is launched to prevent the closure of the Independent Living Fund, ILF, a fund from central government providing crucial personal assistance support to over 18,000 disabled people. 2015. Legislation and policy. The Independent Living Fund, ILF, a government-funded discretionary scheme, was closed in July 2015. For many, the ILF was a cost-effective model of support that gave disabled people choice and control over their own lives. 2017. Legislation and policy. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, issued a report that condemned the UK government's record on disabled people's human rights. CRPD said it had more concerns about Britain than any other country in its 10-year history. 2022. Legislation and policy. The British Sign Language BSL Act is passed. It builds on a formal statement of BSL recognition made by the government in 2003, providing greater legal protection and duties to facilitate and promote BSL.